complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
All right, FuriusPertinax. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing well, sir. Thankfully, we started pressing record and got going because we probably could have talked backstage for another hour if we hadn't got started.
Yeah, that's happened to me. Not again. I try to avoid like podcasting inside baseball stuff because I imagine for the people at home it's incredibly uninteresting. But there have been several times very much like that. Where I end up just talking to a guest and I look down and I'm like, oh, I've been here for an hour and a half. And we haven't recorded a single thing. But like I said, it was a very interesting conversation before, and we managed to nip it in the bud. So hopefully we can continue where we left off.
Indeed. And, just before we get started, I mean, I did say this to you before, happily say it now in the recording, is that, thank you for asking me on. It's a pleasure. We have so many guys in our circle who I think contribute so much, each in their own way. We all have our strengths, our fortes, things that we specialize at. And, say like with me and my, well, not that it's my channel, but I obviously do my history stuff on the Apostolic Majesty channel. We focus on history, we talk about historical subjects and whatever. AA does his stuff, and Radlib does his, Semigog, Charlemagne, Oron McIntyre, yourself, Paul Fahrenheit. We got this wonderful circle of very, gifted and intelligent, insightful individuals. And to be a small segment of that is a real pleasure. And indeed, I appreciate the invite. It's you've done well for yourself in a very short time, so thank you for the kind invite. Much appreciated.
Yeah, definitely, man. And you alluded this to a little bit, but if you could you kind of quickly describe for people who don't know you, kind of what you are and what you do on the internet?
Yes, so I'm one of the very, very few Australians in our circles, because obviously this sort of this sphere is obviously dominated by Brits and Americans, which is logical, and Australians tend to have shall I say peculiarities that sort of don't promote themselves to being sort of scholarly or anything like that. I'm a bit of an oddball actually, because I am I mean, those that in our circles know this, but maybe your audience do not. I'm actually of an Italian extraction, so you might say I've kind of had this life of being not quite in and not quite out of my local society and my local country. But I'm like fully, I've very much have liked the life that I've lived and my upbringing, and I think I suppose like a lot of millennials probably were that generation who got the last insight as to the world as it was. We have a living memory of 9/11 and what was before that. And I've spoken about this too. I'm sure we've maybe even discussed it in spaces, that I think the millennials are an interesting generation in that we not only did we see a bit of the world before in terms of like pre, social media and, pre MySpace and pre Twitter and pre all this other, stuff that we do on the internet. We also lived alongside people who actually saw the world before in the bold, italic, uppercase sense of the world. People who lived through the Great Depression, people who fought in World War One, for instance, people who survived World War II and lived through that, and those kind of people who saw the old world. And those of us who haven't betrayed our essence in our past, though we are few in number, there are a few of us who do, recall that. So I suppose I'm someone who fits into that category in a sense. But as for me and the circles, I funnily enough, I was traveling and I was like, oh, I should, because I deleted my Facebook ages ago. I just don't use it, couldn't be bothered with it. I was traveling, I was like, oh, maybe I'll install Twitter. Just see what's going on, around the world. And then I came across, I'd been watching people like Millennial Woes and Sargon probably since like 2016, like, post Gamergate era. And I've watched obviously Carl's metamorphosis since then. But I started like watching guys like, like I used to watch Millennial, like I used to love like, whacking that on and just watching it all through Christmas period. And then obviously guys like Academic Agent came along, and then, you have the NRX boys, Oron famously, and Charlemagne and Closington, and, et cetera, et cetera. And anyway, I saw this, there was this debate that AA hosted about the essence of the Byzantine Empire, and I said, you really should have someone who has an ethnic interest in this. Like, I'm actually a descendant of Romans. Like, can we have someone who has a vested interest in this debate on? I didn't actually get invited on, by the way, which doesn't matter. It was well debated anyway. But a couple of weeks later, I myself just DM'd Apostolic Majesty and said, listen, I love your work. Because I actually studied history academically at university. I studied medieval and classical and medieval history. And I just said to him out of the blue, I'm like, oh, listen, you and this Columba, you do wonderful work. Just kudos to you. And I'm a history student. I love it. And so it just so happens, and this is where fate does, I'm sure, like, forces beyond our understanding sort of work in a funny way. And he said, well, actually, as a matter of fact, next week I'm starting a whole new series. We're going to do streams on the nations of Charlemagne. Do you want to come on? And I never really thought about YouTube. Career is probably the wrong word to use, but you get what I mean, Mr. Burden. And I thought, what the hell? Like, it was middle of the lockdown. What the hell am I going to do? I'm otherwise sitting on my dad's tractor, like driving around fields and, plowing and spreading fertilizer. So in my downtime, I might as well do this. And, I had my bundle of books on the farm, obviously during COVID. And yeah, we did one stream, and then, he said, come back, and then two, and then many, many, many streams later, and many, many hours later, we're here. And, I've since, I've very much appreciated, being on with AA as well. Like, we've spoken about subjects regarding farming, which, going back to our pre-show discussion, we'll probably touch on that at some point, because it is a conversation quite dear to me, both in terms of the industry I find interesting, and also from a socio-economic standpoint. Farmers are a class and a group of people whom the powers that be have almost always had it in for, especially in the modern period. We've spoken about all sorts of things, because I'm obviously have a history background. We've spoken about, military stuff, all sorts of different subjects. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. So one of the things that's interesting to me, right, is that you've said you're an Australian of Italian extraction, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I'm actually first generation, so both my parents are.
Okay. So I assume, right, from what I know of Italy, which isn't a ton, is that it was pretty rough going for a little bit after the Second World War. So is that when did your parents emigrate in that time roughly?
So I had both my parents fight in the Royal Italian Army of the Second World War. Strangely enough, one got interned by the Allies because I had one grandfather fight in North Africa. He was in one of the Italian armored divisions. And my other grandfather, in fact, didn't technically really get deployed, but he was in Italy when the armistice occurred in September 43, and he ended up being his unit was surrounded by a Hungarian SS division that was deployed in Italy. Operation what was it called? Not Panzerfaust. That was the occupation of Hungary. The Operation Axis, maybe, I think it was called, by the Germans, when they just flooded divisions down the Italian peninsula and occupied it. And it was very haphazard. Some Italian units joined the Germans voluntarily. Some were coerced. Others surrendered. Others fought the Germans. It was a very haphazard and, chaotic affair. And my other grandfather ended up being interred in Germany for 18 months or so. So the war itself has always been of interest in my family on both sides. It's always been talked about. In fact, the one that was in Africa, I used to hear childhood memories about, Rommel and Montgomery and, Spitfires and Messerschmitts and Panzers and stuff like that, and flak guns and, the Royal Navy and all this sort of stuff. So it's sort of something that's always sat at the forefront of my imagination.
So we were talking a little bit before this about farming, and I think that, across kind of, like, shall we say, the first world, there has been an attack on farming, and especially small scale farming.
Oh yeah.
And to me, obviously, I've seen some of it, firsthand, being in a more rural area. Where I am, this used to be tobacco country, right? Virginia tobacco was famous. And then that got crushed, by regulation. It got crushed by, a million and one different things.
And especially the anti-smoking lobby and the health push in the 70s and 80s and stuff. Yeah, which destroyed the industry. Yeah.
And and similarly, when those people who grew tobacco, when they switched to something else, they got slowly crushed, by a variety of, different like mechanisms. And there's one of my favorite authors is a guy who goes by, I guess it's just his real name is Wendell Berry, right? And he's written, in addition to, some nonfiction, which is quite good. He has a, kind of a famous essay, Why I Will Never Own a Computer, which is worth your time. But also he has a series of kind
And
of
who
like
can disagree?
interconnected. Yeah. Has a series of interconnected novels, kind of, exploring the history of a small town in rural Kentucky, over the course of the 20th century, right? From kind of like the early 1920s to kind of present day. And in all of them, there's this kind of moment when these small scale local farmers start to get crushed by industrial farming. And there's a moment in this that I always think about, where one of our main characters is, walking into the new, big box grocery store that opened up in a town, 15 minutes away from his.
Mm.
And he's sitting in the parking lot, and he basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, says something along the lines of, everyone seemed so concerned with how cheap a dozen eggs were, and no one seemed to care that, they didn't know where it came from, and the eggs weren't particularly good to begin with. And so I'm curious, right? Obviously, your family has a history of farming, but what is the landscape like for farmers in Australia? How are they being squeezed, and in what venue are they being kind of pressured into, if that makes sense?
Indeed. If I may, possibly, I might just circle back to where I was, because actually, kind of the two stories tangent onto each other. Where my family are from in just around Naples, my dad's side. So he surrendered, as the Africa Corps did in 43, and ended up being interred by the British and the Americans, and then went home after the war. And for anyone who knows World War II, the Italian theatre, although something of a sideshow, and Churchill quite, in Churchill's great clumsy proclamations, called Italy the soft underbelly of the Reich. And it turns out that actually the campaign in Italy was one of the toughest and hardest fought, and the most incremental of them. And there was tremendous fighting between the landings at Salerno and Anzio. For instance, there's a famous movie, Anzio, made in the, I think, early 60s. And the battles in and around Monte Cassino with the big monastery on the hill, which the General Clark famously bombed, even though there was no one there, and the Germans weren't there. And in fact, the Germans helped the monks to evacuate the monastery and all their priceless artworks before it got bombed. But my grandmother was actually an eyewitness to the battle, essentially. She remembers, I can't remember the date, it might have been like the 24th of August or something, or 24th of July. They were staying up in like the mountains, and she remembers the sky just was pitch black nighttime, and it just is almost like a sunburst. Like the artillery opened up on the American and British side, and just night turned to day. And so much of that territory around there was just like moon craters. And when my grandfather was eventually released and made his way back home, where there was these beautiful lush fields of, of wheat and barley and, fruit trees, citrus. They used to grow melons. In fact, they grew tobacco there, funnily enough, as well. It was just, a literal, if you could imagine, like the face of the moon just full of craters and, bombshells, and every building was flattened. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but even though the Allies had a massive predisponderance of artillery, I mean, my grandmother remembers, like, in the morning there'd be 200 British bombers, and they'd drop their bombs, and then midday there'd be 300 American bombers, and the Brits would bomb in the afternoon, and then the Americans would bomb at night. Just relentless waves of just bombers flying over that part of the world. And so you can imagine what that would be like. I mean, that's war on a truly mass scale. And so we're going to... Something you want to say?
No, I was just going to say, again, and because I am kind of a literature guy, that reminds me very much of kind of like the meta narrative of Catch-22, right? Where our main character, who's the commander on an Allied bomber, flying over Italy, and that book is very much about kind of like the senselessness and just the waste of it all. Mm-hmm. And the moment that always sticks in my mind is, because it is kind of, told, and it was innovative for the time, it was kind of told non-sequentially, is I always remember that he talks about how, the moment that kind of breaks him, and sends him into a personal tailspin, is when he's flying over the town of Orvieto, right, which is a beautiful little, I guess it would have been an Etruscan town at one point, north of Rome.
Orvieto's a settlement that's over 2,000 years old. Yeah.
Right, and he talks about the flying over it and just the seeing the flak burst from in between the buildings and all of that, and then later when eventually his plane drops off its payload, just talking about just like the sheer devastation. But anyway, carry on. That was just an aside.
No, that's actually a wonderful aside, because that actually sort of circus back. I mentioned the battle for Monte Cassino, which is what it's famously known as, but there's also the town of Cassino. And what's interesting about Cassino is Cassino was one of the very, I want to say few, maybe amongst a few hundred, but was one of the places in the south of Italy not devastated by the fall of Rome, and not devastated by the, everyone, in our circles, I know there's always Roma boos, and I'm one of them, obviously. But we always, talk about like Belisarius and his great, the Byzantine reconquest of North Africa and Italy under Belisarius by Emperor Justinian. There's a cluster of towns and villages and cities that were actually unharmed in that process, because that war actually was very destructive for the city of Rome itself and many cities north of Rome, and indeed even around Rome. But Cassino was a town which was essentially intact, because it was the Roman city of Cassino, and many of its old structures were around, intact. And in fact, as a medieval city or medieval town, Monte Cassino was probably one of the best, preserved old towns with its old structures, and with buildings that were hundreds of, or indeed in some places, 1,000, more than a millennia old, years old. They were very, very priceless constructions, and within a matter of 4 months, everything is flattened. And in fact, if anyone who's sort of familiar in history, the German paratroopers, because everyone knows like paratroopers in World War II pretty badass, whether they're Americans or Germans or Italians or Brits even. The German Fallschirmjäger actually earned their nickname in Cassino because the German phrase for the paratroopers was Grüne Teufel, which means green devils. And there was a core of these paratroopers who felt that they had fought so hard on the foothills of Monte Cassino and defended that part of the Gustav line. It's just like, no, our brothers are buried on this hillside. We're not leaving. And so 300 of them actually dug themselves into the rubble and actually kept the Battle of Monte Cassino going for almost another week. So, it goes to show you that what was once a wonderfully historically preserved town was just absolutely blown to smithereens by the end. And this happened in innumerable Italian towns. And, the interesting thing about World War II is, we often think like, oh, Normandy, Operation Overlord, Operation Market Garden, the Netherlands, Northern France, and then, crossing the Rhine into Germany. And, the movies, Bridget Remagen, famous Hollywood, old school Hollywood movie, like the Soviets from the East and the Allies from the West, and flattening Germany in the air campaign. But Italy was, in some ways, arguably caught the worst of it, because they were fighting in Italy for 3 or 4 times longer than they were fighting in Germany. And sorry, not to ramble onto this point, I'll move on. My grandfather came back, essentially, and he's like, oh, this is horrible. So between the money that he had accrued in captivity, being captured in North Africa, in concert with the compensation payments after the war from the government, he rebuilt, the homes and, the infrastructure that a farm has, as modest as they were in the 40s and 50s, rebuilt, sheds and chook pens and, silos and barns and that sort of stuff. And then he decided to move to the New World. And it's kind of funny that I often speak with my dad about this. And it's like, we left a place that was green and lush and we came to this, which brings us to Australia, because you asked about what the climate and the biome is like here in Australia. And most of Australia is actually extremely marginal country. And for anyone who's interested in agriculture and farming as a topic, I've spoken with AA, Academic Agent, once about this, and I've also had a good conversation with Ratlib, and I've also spoken to Mr. Patriarch. So if that interests you, check out those channels. I've spoken about agriculture there. Suffice to say, my grandfather came out in the 50s and was often true with that genre of people The husbands shipped out first with what little money they had. They worked very difficult labor jobs, like proper physical work. I'm talking like clearing trees and working out in the bush and, trying to scrounge a few pennies and pounds here and there, just enough to sort of get enough money together to start. And it was very, very modest back then. I think I might have mentioned this on somewhere else. I can't remember, but like my grandfather, when he was clearing country, like when he was cutting down trees and then, with very, very rudimentary machinery, pulling the big tree stumps out and then cleaving them apart and burning them. My grandfather used to actually sweat so much that he have to actually buy new singlets every month because the amount of sweat that would pour out of his body, the salt would stiffen the fabric and actually basically shred it. It would decay the cotton. So, that shows you how hard the work was. And in a hot climate, like, if you leave an Australian city, if you go 3-4 hours, 5 hours out of an Australian city, 6-10 hours, however far, much of that climate, if it's not the south, which is sort of almost Appalachian or almost like middle northern French or German, right? Sort of similar to Britain in some ways, or the very north, which is tropical and much like Southeast Asia, that middle band of Australia is dry. People say Mediterranean climate, and it is in places, but it's dry, it's harsh, it's uncompromising, flies, dust. Much of the non-coastal area is semi-arid, and it's, for a long time, it was a hard country that bred hard men. And those kind of men, like my grandfather and their generation, went out in their thousands and made lives out of nothing. And that, for simple men, they achieved a lot.
So broadly speaking, I know that we've seen this kind of like push for, ever greater industrial farming. And one of the problems that has really affected, individual farmers in the US at least, is that the input prices are insane. So
Yes.
if you need a harvester, it can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then parts for it are thousands of dollars. And the same duplication of cost has affected everyone. Is that something that you guys have experienced as well?
Doubtless. In fact, as a small anecdote, this side of the coof and the lockdowns and the consequences from that, between supply lines and economic shortfalls and productivity problems and whatever, which are all exacerbated now with this, suffice to call it this extremity in the Donbass, and let's just leave that there. Because obviously there's economic strife in places like Germany, places like, Britain and even Italy, where they manufacture things of an agricultural nature. France, even, there's even more of a shortfall that's sort of exacerbated by those circumstances. When maybe this side of, say, 2000, the year 2000, a new harvester, and the harvester is the machine, and then it comes with like what we call a front, which is sort of the header, and that's got the tines and the cutting fingers, and that's what sort of cuts the, if you see one driving through a crop, I mean, that's what's sort of cutting the straw, and it falls onto the front, and sort of these flat conveyor belts sort of bring it into the center of the machine, and then there's these metallic retractable fingers, hydraulic fingers, bring it into like the guts of the machine, which has all these very sophisticated and with insanely tiny tolerances. Because the other thing, they got to work in extreme sort of summer heat. They're always going. These things are rotating at, several of these parts are rotating at, 1,000 RPM, 5,000 RPM, 10,000 RPM. In some cases more, some cases less. And they have to be lubricated and they have to be cooled, and and then obviously you can't have combustibles because in the middle of summer that's a fire hazard. In fact, many Australians, and I'm sure probably happens in America too, farmers often lose their harvesters to mechanical malfunction and the fires that arise out of them. It's quite a risky thing as well, but the manufacturers, to their credit, whether it's John Deere or Claas or New Holland or not Massey Ferguson, Case International, whatever, they have made these machines very reliable despite all that, and they've a lot of research and development has made these machines very sophisticated and very reliable and very strong to suit the conditions. Nonetheless, the point I was trying to make was that around the year 2000, a harvester would have cost you maybe 300,000. I'm talking Australian dollars, so 300, 350, 400 for a top model. By the time my parents retired, just before or just like around COVID starting, like 2020-ish, that became like a $600,000 figure, $700,000 figure, which if you consider inflation, like it's not that outrageous. They doubled in 20 years. But from the start of COVID to now, they've gone from 650, 700 to pushing $1 million. I know of a farmer now who paid over $900,000 Australian for a harvester. Admittedly, he got like the top of the line with all the fruit on it. But I mean, you got to think, for a family farmer who doesn't have any kind of subsidy, who, even if this farmer were to have off-farm assets that sort of presented passive income, and a lot of people don't know this, but essentially there's two things that a farmer thinks about with a harvester, and that is, I can't run this into the ground because it will become valueless. You have such a huge capital erosion by retaining a machine for too long, both in terms of operating hours, which impacts value, and obviously just age. And so farmers will aim to trade in their harvesters anywhere from, say, 3 to 5 years. And if times are tough, they might push it to 6. Like, that's really rare. My family tended to do 4, give or take, but like usually 4 was our sweet spot. And you're hitting that sweet spot between that depreciation and that capital erosion, and then sort of being able to trade that machine in for enough money that you could sort of afford the new one, if that makes sense. But these are still huge capital outlays for family farmers. You got to think that's just like every 3, 4, 5 years, that's boom, $500,000 out, $500,000 out, $500,000 out. And that's a machine that you use for anywhere from 5 to 9 weeks in a year. And the rest of the time it's just sat in his barn or a shed doing nothing. But you basically need it, because if you're a farmer who crops, that's how the dollars come in. Not many businesses, are that oriented around machinery of that nature that is so valuable, yet utilized so little, yet is so valuable to the productivity of the operation, if you get my meaning.
Right. And one of the other things that I think has become apparent is that the quality of newer machines is deteriorating pretty rapidly. Right. So my experience is on a pretty large 400 head of cattle farm, and obviously it's a different set of machines, but nonetheless they still have big tractors for mowing hay and the like. And it's interesting because they have old, I think it's like New Holland tractors from the 70s that still run, and they run great.
Yeah.
But the newer machines, they're incredibly complicated. And so, you or I, not only in many cases can't, because they're designed to be quote unquote tamper proof, but they're not necessarily simple appliances anymore. And the same, regulatory creep that has made, modern cars into just like soulless pods has
White
essentially,
goods.
yeah, exactly, has essentially made, large scale industrial equipment almost, unusable. And don't get me wrong, some of the creep is in luxury. Like a lot of new tractors have air conditioning, which, to be honest, is a lot better than sitting in a closed cab, when it's, 40 degrees, 40 degrees centigrade.
Yeah.
And nonetheless, right, there very much is this kind of like increase in capital requirement. And it's no shock, right, that essentially people can't keep up with it because everything is getting more expensive. Obviously, fertilizer has been in the news. But when you have all of your inputs going up in prices, you have deliberately punitive legislation, trying to get you to sell out. And then on the back end, in many cases, the people you're supplying are completely screwing you over. So in the US, the price of meat has shot up dramatically. And part of that is COVID stuff. But another part of it is that, meat packers and feedlots essentially operate like a cartel. They fix prices. And it makes it impossible for people who aren't the size of a massive conglomerate like Tyson's or, these like, horrible global corporations to compete. It's impossible.
Just on that point very quickly too. And the things with that sort of cartel operation of an industry, particularly one that sort of sits in the middle of that. If you consider an industry or a production process having like this vertical layer of production, you sort of down the bottom you have the primary producers, you have the cattle farmers and the ranchers, right? Right. And then, above them you might have the commercial intermediary that sort of transacts the sale of bulls or and heifers and whatever and calves. And then above that you might have the abattoirs and the processors. And then above that you've got the wholesalers, and the wholesalers sell to the retailers, and then the retailers eventually sell to the consumers, right? At the sort of end of that production line, out to where demand is, right? Or where the supply meets the demand, at shops, at supermarkets, at, whatever. You have that cartel set up, like you've just said about the bulls, about beef, and they will screw the farmer by trying to get down the per head price as much as possible. Yet they will then, because they essentially are controlling the midpoint of the market, where eventually sort of like processors and wholesalers aren't. It's really difficult for them to get other sources of beef. Then they can jack up, as the legitimate middleman can jack up the next point of sale in that vertical process, and ultimately it impacts the consumers at the end, because how many more people can then add their cut on top before it becomes an unaffordable product. So there's this sort of meat in the sandwich that is really distorting supply and demand. I mean, I'm not Radlib, I'm not an economist, I probably can't speak to with much authority. It'd probably be worth us having a conversation together one time about it, about this particular thing, because it's a very fascinating dynamic that occurs with primary production, which then goes out into public sale, as meeting public demand for X product. Whether it's flour or beef, it doesn't really matter, or chickens or eggs, the same. The principle's ultimately the same, but it's those people there who can prohibitively distort a market. And we've actually suffered that in Australia with dairy. Actually, dairy has been the industry in both Tasmania and New South Wales and Western Australia has been almost eviscerated by milk pricing wars between our two major supermarket chains, because they wanted to sell dollar per liter milk. And unless you believe in magic pudding economics that comes out of Mao's handbook, or Milton Friedman's imagination, like you can't economically produce dollar a liter milk that everybody gets their fair cut along the way. It's absurd. And just back to your example there, it harms the people who matter, and that is the people who make the beef and grow the beef and breed the cattle, and the people at the end who just want to be able to put steak on their family's table. And if you really delve into a little bit deeper, which maybe we shouldn't, we could possibly leave this to a sequel or something, but there are people who have inordinate control over the economy who have no qualms about distorting this on purpose. And I think that's what we're also seeing too, to some degree.
That's definitely true. And I think also because, and look, like one of the things that I think the sphere is kind of, accepted almost as a premise is kind of the basic tenets of elite theory, right? And one of the reasons I think you see, especially in the 20th century, an attack on, individual farmers is that they really do become this kind of like kulak class, right?
Doubtless.
Because
absolutely right.
In addition to being incredibly important, and you see this across both farmers, but also people like truckers and small business owners, that these people do have power. And they may not individually have power, but as a group they do, because they provide, essential goods and services, and they also have a good bit of capital. And I think that
they possess the resources in question.
Yes. And I think that we've seen, over the last, 30, 40, 50 years, an attack on people like that. So we've obviously, talked about, kind of like the attack on farming. They don't want there to be small and mid-scale farms. They want everyone to be, a giant, Monsanto industrial, operation. Similarly
for McWorld, right?
Exactly. Similarly with truckers, right? They're trying to get rid of truckers because truckers are not only have, in some cases they own, an expensive piece of equipment, but we need them, and they don't want to have to, need them at all, hence the push towards autonomous driving. Similarly, COVID was a massive destruction of, the quote unquote kulaks. And again, I'm using that term loosely, of course. And again, it is incredibly, on one hand, it makes sense politically, but it is incredibly short-sighted, because you're not merely, producing more of an equivalent process. by scaling something to an industrial scale, you are making it worse, right? Like the easiest example is the difference between, the cheapest bottom of the barrel, you know, mass produced, eggs, just the bleached white ones that you can buy, for the cheapest price in the big box store,
Mm-hmm.
versus if you've ever had eggs that someone's actually
that have pale yellow yolks and runny whites and are laid in cages, and the chickens are emaciated and stink and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
right, and then there
Mm.
is a material difference. And so one of the other
Yes.
things about you that I find interesting, in addition to your history and your background in agriculture, is that you're quite a cook. So I'm curious, how does
Thank
that
you,
kind
sir.
of affect the way you view things? I know that you're infamous for being on a seed oil jihad, but I'm
Yes.
curious what you have to say on that front.
Yes, the proclaimer of the great seed oil fatwa on right wing Twitter. Yes. Well, the thing is that having, I know there's always a meme about like there's never an Italian who doesn't know how to cook, and that's like almost true. There's a few exceptions, but yes. And I was fortunate that the women in my family were all excellent cooks. I don't even say that as like a sexist, intentionally bigoted statement. It's just a matter of fact. Like, my grandmothers were excellent cooks. My mother is a wonderful cook. My aunties were all great cooks. Like, heck, like, even my cousin, I have actually one of my sisters and I have another cousin who are themselves both good cooks. All that being said, like, the next generation didn't embrace it nearly as much as like three of us as millennials who enjoy cooking, and the rest just can't be bothered. But it's being in that environment where, and I think, funnily enough, I think Carl might have mentioned this at the end of his recent cigar stream with AA, and I know they're like talking about like the whole, WWYD sort of thing and med aesthetics, and he's like, "Oh, I've taken the FuriusPertinax pill about med aesthetics," but it's not just that too. Into like it, it's not just the approach about meds and how they look or how we see them. It's also their way of life. And he mentioned something about how like women dress a certain way because they wish to express their femininity, and maybe what we would call feminism hasn't impacted them as much. I would say that's also quite true at the level of how things function domestically. And see, like, I remember vividly growing up where like the men were out operating machines, or driving sheep, or fixing fence lines and planting either crops or trees, or doing all manner of things that a farm requires to take over. And then going to the homestead, and there's 3-4 women, and they're all buttering bread and cutting pieces of roast, and filling lunch boxes, and this wonderful aroma of things cooking, and pots on the stove. And it was it's one of the most cherished memories of my childhood. And just the modern deracinated urbanite will go, "Oh, that's sexist," or particularly women would object to that. And it's just like, no, this is this is a time honed symbiosis that works. This is where men who have a capability in certain areas and women who have capabilities in other areas meet and make this work, both as a family and as a business. Because really, that's the ultimate fundamental truth about farming, is that your life is your work and your work is your life, and those two things are almost inseparable, right? Like, you live where you work, and you hear the sheep barring in bar in the afternoon, or you hear the cows mooing in the morning, and the chickens crowing at sunrise. And one lives amongst it, and a person either likes that or doesn't, right? Which is also why a lot of young people don't actually go back, and why I've chosen to, because I actually like the tranquility, I like the peace and quiet, I like the slow pace. That's just me. And to some degree, I've had to come to that in my 30s, whereas in my 20s I was less like that, you might say. But there was this resistance to that change that I dare say, sadly, it's probably affected millennials now. Like, I think that like the whole feminist agenda has probably happened to the millennials, and now those things that I've described are probably less prevalent now and have become less prevalent. Which isn't to say that there aren't people who do that, but the dynamics awfully has changed an awful lot in 20, 30 years. But the thing is, like with the cooking, is that realizing that food has a genesis, food has an origin point. And also, because when I was a young man, I decided to take the culinary path. It was the first thing I did when I left high school. Is that, I mean, I've always been interested in food. Food's been such a central part of my life. Is that, well, I'm a farmer and I've seen the Genesis point. I want to work at the other end, and I did for several years. I did for a while. I was in the industry for about 2.5 years, 3 years, and I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I'm of a certain character where I don't want to work in that kind of an environment for the entirety of my life, because it is highly stressful. It's highly demanding. There's a whole lot of things that come with restauranting and chefing that you have to be of a certain disposition, and that's not me. But I'm still glad I did what I did. But there's this interesting sort of thing whereby, again, it's that, like what I said about the vertical production structure, if you have like the farmers and the ranchers at the bottom and then the end people buying the meat at the supermarket, it's kind of like that, literally in the formative sense that a farmer will grow wheat or barley or canola or whatever it is, and raise, because we have a massive sheep industry in Australia, because sheep are some of the best animals to run on this so-called marginal country with sort of patchy rainfall and logistical difficulties and the tyranny of distance and all this sort of stuff. And we export a lot of sheep because many people buy it. I mean, you can buy Australian lamb in America, in the USA. You buy American lamb in Canada. You can buy American lamb, Australian lamb in China. You can buy it in Indonesia. You can buy it, in Britain. It's very widely sought after. And then like being able to cook with that stuff is also fantastic. And I think I think my fascination probably arises from that. Inversely, I myself, when I was chefing, I used to be like really unhealthy, and because I had to, I transformed my life, because I was like, if you don't change, the old doctor reading the riot act is like, if you don't change, you're going to have a very short life. And I was like, well, do I want to be sort of like, obese and, shoveling carbohydrates and, not doing anything and just going to bed and slumping out of pure tiredness, or do I want to change? And I decided to change my life. And consequently, like the whole, I know, like I'm this meme in our circles about the whole seed oil fatwa, but this is the thing. And thankfully, we've done a couple of really good streams with Academic Agent last year. Myself and a friend of mine who's sort of like not in our circles but adjacent, a bloke by the name of Tristan Haggard, and I suggest people follow him. He's very, very good about this, and not just explaining, oh, they're doing this stuff to us, but also why. Why is meat discouraged? Why are we being sold bunk food science? Why is there this almost tsunami-like agenda to get people into plant-based food? And why are they encouraging these things which are objectively deleterious to us? Eating meat replacement, Impossible Burgers, all this patent nonsense. And again, as a farmer, I've been informed by this to some degree. Like, I know that there's this natural symbiosis between having chickens and cattle and pastures, and in the event that one does accept cropping and grains and whatever, a paddock being harvested and cropped for cereal, and then you plant a legume there because peas and lupins, rather than taking nitrogen out of the soil, recharge the soil with nitrogen, which makes it fertile again. And then you leave paddocks fallow, because then fallow paddocks, up comes the pasture following the breakout rains, at the start of winter, or sort of tail end of summer, heading into winter. And you run your sheep on there or your cattle, and they eat the grass and they keep it nice and level, and they poop on the soil and nourish it. This stuff works. Like, it's a symbiosis. Humans have been doing this since the foundation of civilization. I suppose to some degree my interest in history chimes in here as well, Mr. Burden, because like, there is no discussion about the origin of civilization without humans' interaction with the world around it. And a part of that origin point is the domestication of animals. Why is it in the Fertile Crescent, in what we call Mesopotamia and modern day Syrian and the Levant, Iraq, you look at these early civilizations, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Phoenicians, the Hittites, Egypt, ancient Egypt as well. They started forming communities because it was easy to protect each other. They could then They had slight excesses of labor. They could go into the fields. They could harvest, crops that they domesticated back then. It was, things like millet and spelt and these old ancient grains. And then they realized that actually growing these grains in concert with rearing animals made sense, because once you take the heads of the grain and you have your grains from which you make flour and other things, you are then left with chaff, and you have hay, and animals eat hay and that nourishes them, and then you end up with these plump oxen and cows and pigs and everything else. And humans don't do this because it doesn't work. They do it because it does work. And then some dude who created an operating system 25, 30 years ago comes along and says, actually, no, you got to eat soy instead, and you've got to not eat beef, and meat's bad for you and it's going to give you heart disease, and it's a load of nonsense. And you mentioned about the enemies of agriculture, which is actually the title of the stream I did with Mr. Patriarch. It's the enemy of farmers insofar that they attack farmers as a class and as a socioeconomic group, but also it's in part an agenda to attack the health and the well-being of the farmer, which is why the isolation is dangerous, why the socio-demographic changes of agricultural towns is dangerous, why farmers feeling compelled to educate their kids and send them to boarding schools in the cities that then pos their children is dangerous. And then if they can make them sick, fat, and unhealthy, well, you've got them from every possible attack vector. And then you're imposing that on the society writ large. And then politicians can say, well, it's not us growing the stuff, it's farmers. It's all,
So I'm
it's
curious.
all stacked against them, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I'm curious.
Sorry,
right?
that was a tangent, by the way. I didn't mean
No,
to
not at all, man. That's what this show's for. In my experience, talking to farmers, I have a decent amount. I have friends, and I speak to them about such topics. And a common refrain is, they don't understand what they're doing. That they're attacking the farms that feed them. Talking about people who are especially pro-environmental or any of these things. But again, we've talked about these kind of enemies of farming. People who want us eating diets that are really not suited for human consumption. And I'm curious, what do you think the end game is here? Why is this being pushed?
Well, it's hard to always put oneself into the imagination of one's adversaries, and I almost think to myself, because me being me, I'm going to use a historical analogy. It would have been easier being, Pericles trying to put himself in the mind of his Spartan adversary. It would have been easier for Vercingetorix to put himself in the mind of Caesar, or it would have been easier for Wellington to put himself in the mind of Napoleon, or whatever juxtaposed opponent, Saladin, Richard Lionheart, take whoever you want, right? Because at least those people to some degree fought as peers. They had a notion of honor. They had a notion of being products of a civilization that had expectations and standards, and either spoken and how can I put this, objective moral standards, or more gentlemanly kind of agreed subjective notions of morality or honor or whatever, right? These things are very rare now. They're a very highly endangered species in our modern day. And those who are enemies of I suppose us to some degree, but the classes who you might say are obstructions to those powers that be and those who have their hands on levers of power, right, don't. So actually trying for us to put ourselves in the minds of those creatures is difficult. But needless to say, it is often the next best thing to simply hear what they say and watch what they do. And when you see that, say, in the context of the United States, that one of the largest holders of, one of the largest owners of freehold land in the USA is Mr. William Fentz. Well, why? Gets the noggin jogging. When you consider his own personal orientations and his beliefs and his statements and the kind of world vision he not only aspires to, but actually acts out through his deeds and his, dealings. tells you everything you really need to know. That these people are, whether you want to call them Malthusian or whether you want to call them, anti-natal or anti-human, or you can think of any number of descriptives that, describe these people. I don't necessarily know why. Like in the end, I just want to be left alone, like the Cincinnatus, to plow my fields and tend to my trees, and I just want a quiet life. But these are people who will meddle with the world. And I suppose you mentioned earlier, use the phrase elite theory, which is very much touches on this. These elites are people who, or creatures, I should say, because anyway, they want a world in an image that they require, or as they desire. But as always, and a bit like the example, I mean, I know it's a bit cringy, sort of making Orwell references here, but whilst the people in 1984 are being fed their slop, don't worry, the Politburo are still going to have their steaks and their fine wine and their cheeses, and the fresh coffee and sugar, and the stuff that is palatable and nice. The rest of us will be subjected to misery. I wish that wasn't the case, but it is.
So this is kind of an aside, and generally I try to avoid, like internecine, right-wing conflict, because I think it's kind of stupid and a waste of time. But to me, I've never been convinced by the idea that, like, and this is probably more a meme than a seriously held position, but like the real problem was when, humans invented agriculture. We need to go back. We need to become, hunter-gatherers, because, and you saying that these people are anti-human, I think is very accurate, because in a weird, like, we really became humans. We developed civilization when we developed agriculture.
Right.
There's no, it's no accident that if you look at, early cuneiform or anything, all of the symbols are essentially derived from agriculture, right? And if you consider yourself to be connected to, Western civilization, whatever your civilization is, and pro that civilization, you want it to continue, you want it to flourish, then that is in many ways, based in farming, right? So in the US, and this is gone and dead, it was kind of built as, an agrarian republic, and that kind of died in 1865, truly
Sorry to
in full.
interrupt you, Burden, but I was going to say that is also why the founding fathers idolized people like Cincinnatus or Cincinnatus. The early American constitutional republic, the reason they took so many inspirational sort of points from early Republican Rome was that they saw this commonality in them, like what they saw in early Republican Rome, they saw in themselves in a strange way. I mean, you're an American, you know this better than me, but as a Roman historian, that's what I perceive.
Well, right, and there's also something for the fact that if we are interested in a group of people, with kind of, creating new elites, right, creating a new group of people to rule over us, maybe now or in the future, then if you look at, where historically did, elites come from? Well, and to be honest, those people were tied to land. You had a noble title, and that noble title told people, where you were from. And obviously there have always been cosmopolitans. And I think that this kind of like relatively arbitrary urban versus rural divide, that kind of springs up in these circles is kind of stupid. But there definitely is a nobility that comes from, working the land and making something truly your own. If you get what I'm kind of poking around there.
Doubtless. There's a couple of factors to that I've thought long and hard about. I mean, not like not in a particularly scholarly sense, or like I've done a research paper or thesis about it, but just pondered on the subject broadly. And one that, and this is a truism of my dad's actually, is that there's infrequently in existence a dishonest farmer, because ultimately a farmer has to transact with so many people. A farmer has to, buy rams off someone if they're breeding sheep, or they have to buy bulls off someone who runs a stud in order if they want to maintain the genetics of their flock, depending whatever, like I said, cow, sheep, whatever. A farmer, in the modern day, in this sort of modern day of sophisticated agriculture, which I think has deviated sadly for the worst. But if a farmer's going to crop in the modern context, he needs to buy fertilizers, he needs to buy urea, he needs to buy, chemicals, and has to, herbicides and insecticides and this sort of stuff. And he has to buy and sell his grain. He has to work with agronomists, has to work with a marketer, has to, farmer needs a relationship with his local, if he's from a local town, he needs a relationship with his fuel distributor, he needs a relationship with his tire shop, needs a relationship with his mechanic. There's an implicit degree of extreme high trust required when that's done at the local level. If you, for example, run an account up at the local mechanic and don't pay your bills, well, you have to go to the next town. And rest assured, that mechanic in that next town knows that you've ripped off the mechanic in your own town. So good luck getting the work done. And if you do, you're paying up the nose, or you're going to be paying deposits first, because reputations spread quickly. So inherently, farmers have to act with a degree of, dare I say, like intrinsic nobility, intrinsic honesty. And I know we joke about the whole certain civilizations produce high trust societies and do so in very limited contexts, right? A farming community, an agricultural community, is probably the truest extrapolation of that, or the truest kind of example of that occurring, is because you can't sort of cheat your way out of it. If you're a farmer and you alienate people either at the purchasing end or the selling end, well, no one's going to do business with you, and you'll be disliked. And even from a standpoint of, you live in a small community, people will not want to be around you, people will not include you, people won't like you. And so if you're either an independent person with no attachments to life, or you have a family, just living in your town becomes objectively more difficult, because people like being around people who are good and decent and honest. And I think in some ways, by almost accident, I suppose, agricultural farming communities have become that almost by default.
That's a good point you make there. And we're kind of running out of time here, Furious. So if you could tell everyone, where they can find you, and if they want, where can they support you? Where should they head?
Oh, well, I'm merely just a hopeless Twitter denizen. If you want to sort of follow me when I talk about gym or cooking, or if you wish to partake in my seed oil fatwa, and upset Mr. D relentlessly, and also every so often we host space. You've listened in on a couple of them. I often join Mr. D spaces because I love chatting. Him and I can just go for hours. And I mean, his streams are gigantic. They're monumental. They go for several hours. He's a wonderful exemplar of our circles, Mr. D. So I'm on Twitter. My handle is FuriusPertinax. And actually, on the Roman theme, just if I may indulge very briefly, Mr. Burden, the first part, Furius, is Marcus Camillus Furius. He was considered the second founder of Rome. Basically saved Rome at the point where it was nearly sacked by the Cisalpine Gauls. And Pertinax being an emperor at the tail end of the sort of golden age, which, had he not been assassinated, Rome could have possibly taken a different turn. But he tried to impose laws on a self-indulgent and self-interested and spineless aristocratic elite, and they killed him for it. Much like, if you're familiar with later Roman history, Aurelian and Majorian tried to do the same things and suffered similar fates. So they're my two Roman inspirations that make up my handle.
That's interesting. I didn't know the backstory on that. And obviously, those
my friend.
Those will be, linked in the description if any of you guys, want to check out Furious. I'll probably also have a few of your streams with Apstock Majesty linked, because those are quite good. Anyway, guys,
I would say, just if I may, Mr. Burton, I was going to say, maybe if you just share our two playlists, because we've got like the Nations of Charlemagne and the Orthodoxy, Autocracy, Nationalism. They're in like, how YouTube does like the playlist format. Probably just share the two playlists, because that's the bulk of our work. And indeed, as you've said, I mostly am on the Apostolic Majesty channel. Usually it's him, myself, and Columba. Occasionally we have guest appearances with people like Hitman or Semigog. We always have wonderful input from people from other spheres who have different specializations. I occasionally frequent the Prudentialist channel or whatever. You'll see me around, and I'm always AA and I always talking shit. So there's and indeed, I mean, I've enjoyed this, Mr. Burden. I don't think we barely scratched the surface. So if you fancy another conversation again, let's do it.
Yeah, definitely. I'll add you to my normal rotation. This was a good conversation, and like you said, we barely scratched the surface. So,
Indeed.
for you guys at home, you know where to find me. The show's available on YouTube and Odyssey. It's also available as an audio only show on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I've recently done a couple of appearances on other people's shows. I recently had my episode with Pete Quinones drop on his podcast. You should check that out. And then coming up soon, it might actually drop by the time this is out. I'll be on the Blood and Rain podcast, which is a podcast I'd never heard of before, but after being invited on, I listened to it and I recommend it quite a lot. The guys who run that are really, really putting out good work. In addition, if you want to support me, you can do that on, the normal platforms, again, linked. And the benefit you get for that is you get to hear pre-recorded episodes early. For instance, like this one, if you're watching it on YouTube, you saw it in the normal stream, which is, when it would have come out anyway. And if you're watching it early, I appreciate it. Every little bit helps, and it helps cover the cost of the show. And anyway, guys, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.